Oh, wait. I have to do this differently. Let's see. It's not going to work. Okay.
Who are already.
Let me find the right spot. Okay. I have to do that. Okay.
Jesus.
Okay. Because of what Jesus said, promised?
Because of what he does.
Okay, so here on the screen, John 11. And whosoever liveth, you'd agree this is Jesus saying this?
Yes.
Okay. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Believest thou this? Do you believe that?
Yeah.
Okay. So if Jesus tells the truth, what must be true based on this passage?
Yeah, you believe in him and you will not die.
Okay. So what is true based on the words of Jesus here is that you'll never die. So if you died right now, physically, you'll be in heaven.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's eternal security right there. Whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Do we believe this, that we will never die?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so never die. Well, what if you died?
Okay, it doesn't mean that for sure. Nothing about that means you go to heaven when you die. There's nothing there about that, is my point. But it is true that if you are believing in Jesus, you won't die permanently. And it's also true in its context that the one spoken of there will never see death, but it has nothing to do with there's nothing to do with what he said. So look at this. Let's see. Let me zoom in. The reason that's a bad interpretation is because you see verse 25. Notice how it says, I'm the resurrection. The one believing in me, active ongoing, the one who is believing. Even if he should die, or even though he may die, or even though he dies, he will live. Okay? So, first of all, it's not ones who did believe one time or have believed, past tense. It's the one actively believing. Okay, and we can talk about what believing means, but it certainly isn't there's nothing there that suggests a one and done believed. Okay, it's the active believing, which is faith. Okay, so if you're alive and you believe in Jesus, you will die. That's apothene there, 599. But you will live. Okay. So in verse 26, and everyone living and believing in me is usually translated, the one living and believing will never die. But in the Greek, as you can see, it's the one living and believing in me never not shall die. Into the age. Ice tone Iona. So notice what we have here. We have the one Notice the believing. Everyone living and believing. Pisteuon, the same as up here in verse 25. Pisteuon, believing, actively believing. In me, well, ume, that's not a chance. That's it's two negatives that build on each other. They don't cancel each other out like in English. So this is like saying it couldn't happen. No, never. No, not ever. Apothene. So it's with emphasis, you cannot die. It cannot happen. In the Greek there, ume. Okay. So if you have pisteuon in Jesus, because it's Jesus speaking, can't possibly die, right? Okay, can't possibly apothene. The one actively pisteuon in Jesus, the one speaking, cannot possibly die. That's a right translation. But what does it mean? Well, notice up here. Believing, same word, pisteuon, 4100, in Jesus, the active believing one in Jesus, the one speaking, can apothene, but will live. The word for death here is the same word for death here. So he's literally saying, if the one believing in me, if he does apothene, he will live. And the one down here who's believing in Jesus can't possibly apothene. That's a contradiction. Same word for death, same word for believing. What's the difference between the two statements? The first one is a believing one in Jesus who dies, and then if he's made alive. That's the resurrection. Okay. And now what's added to the second statement? Now it's not just believing in him, which people who believe in him do apothene, but are resurrected. And now after that, he says, the one living and believing, not just believing, will never die in the age, the aeon, which you don't even know is there in the English. It just says will never die. So it's confusing, right? And so people say, oh, well, this death is a different kind of death. And this is that's physical death, and this is spiritual death. Nothing there that says that at all. That's adding to the text. The word for death is the same word for death here, and the same word for death here. Same word for believing, actively believing, the believing one. Same word. And the believing, active believing is in the one speaking, which is Jesus. So the only way this doesn't make a contradiction, if you don't add to the text and try to say it's a different kind of death, and it depends on what you mean by kind, but the word for death is the same. The kind of dying that happens up here is the same kind of dying down here. The difference is the believing one here hasn't had a resurrection. So if you believe in Jesus, even though you die, you'll be resurrected. And now down here, and now if you're alive, presuming this is one whole idea, if you've been made alive and you're a believer, you'll never die in the coming age. That's all it says, if you just take it for what it says. So you do die as a believer. That's what verse 25 says. In the same way, the same way you won't ever die again if you're resurrected by Jesus. That's what this means. And in a way, in a sense, you can call that but the idea that you don't die if you're a believer in Jesus, yeah, you don't die the second death, as the Bible calls it. You won't possibly face the second death, which is dying a second time, which it makes sense why it's the second death, because death means not being alive. So the death that all this you can take from this is that what happens to us when the way that we die now is just asleep, because that's what he teaches in John 11 about Lazarus. He even messes with him. He's like, oh, he's just asleep. They're like, oh, well, let's let him rest then. He's like, and then Jesus tells them plainly, Lazarus is dead. So it's literally a teaching here that people miss because they have like made up stuff that they bring in. But the dying word for death is the same. So the way you will die if you're a believer, that is what Jesus calls asleep. When he resurrects you, because he'll make you alive, because he is, that's what he says right here. I am the resurrection of life. He's the source of life and resurrection. And he's going to resurrect Lazarus. And it's the same thing at his second coming. Dead people are made alive again. So it has nothing to do with the fact you can't say from this text you'll never die. It flies in the face of what he said in verse 25. So this has nothing to do with eternal security. It has to do with if you're in Christ, then he's going to raise you up. And if he raises you up, you'll never be able to die again. And the kind of dying you won't do, what that can't happen ever again, is just the same kind of dying that will happen to you, that he'll resurrect you from. If you don't want to add to the text and you want to take the context into consideration and not add any ideas that the language doesn't, and if anything, the language suggests it's the same kind of death in its nature, because it uses the same word, and it adds the living to the second phrase. And you look at this one, how is it that you can die here but can't possibly die here? Well, because up here is the idea of the resurrection, and down here it adds that the one who was made alive to the believing, and the one who's been made alive that did die, who's a believer, will never die again. Same word for death, same word for believing. The believing one will be made alive, and now that he's alive and a believing one can never die in the age to come, because Jesus' return and the resurrection happen at the same time. And if you're a saint, you get your immortal body at the resurrection and can no longer suffer the death you used to be able to suffer as a mortal, which Jesus resurrects you from.